In today's video, we're going to be diving into the world of survey design, in particular, the use of response scales. A scale is a standardized system for collecting responses to questions. This can include ordinal scales, also known as the Likert scale, where you see options like strongly agree, somewhat agree, strongly disagree, etc. But it can also involve scales like numerical or interval scales, where a respondent will rate something on a scale of 1 to 10. And there's been a fair bit of research carried out over the years that has explored how survey respondents across different countries may respond to scales differently. But the past research hasn't really focused on Southeast Asia, which happens to be where Milieu is based, here in Singapore. And so we wanted to explore the potential impact that culture and language may have on survey participants across Southeast Asia when it comes to responding to surveys and online research. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our very own Antarika Sen, who is one of our senior researchers who run some really interesting experiments that are designed to help us understand how to design and execute better surveys in online research. Antarika, how are you doing today?
Hey, Steve. Thanks for the intro. Doing great. Really excited to share more.
Thanks for being here, Antarika. And you have just recently wrapped up a really interesting experiment, which was designed to explore how respondents in different countries may respond to response scales differently. So do you want to maybe start off just by telling us a little bit about the surveys or the experiment that you ran? Maybe start off with the intentions or the objectives of the study, and also the methodology that you took. And then we'd love to dive into the results as well.
Sure, great. Yeah, you're right. Recently, I ran an experiment that involved understanding how respondents from different countries may differ in the way they use rating scales. And I'm very excited about this topic because it's something we do very commonly with our clients. We run, for example, brand tracking studies across markets where clients want to understand how consumers of different markets differ in terms of brand usage or brand health. We also run a lot of polls that try to understand how general attitudes to different topics differ across the studies. But we haven't really got down to dissecting actual opinion and behavior versus biases towards using scales. So that was like the overarching theme of the experiment. And I'd love to dive deep into our experiment. But before that, let me just share some context before we dive in. So the general theme of this discussion is going to be unpacking survey response biases across cultures. And we'll end the discussion with, offering some really useful tips if you're into designing cross-culture, cross-market studies. What are some effective tips that you can keep in mind before carrying out these researches? So before we dive in, I just wanted to set some context as to why this area is important to kind of delve into and understand more. So there was this very, very interesting study done by Gallup in the year 2011 and 2012. So essentially, they carried out this poll across 148 different countries. And the aim of the study was to see how countries differ in the way they experience positive emotions. So it was a set of 5 questions, yes or no, and all 148 countries answered this question. And the aim of the poll was essentially to come up with a ranking. And what you see on screen is a set of countries color-coded in blue, which were the top 10 countries in terms of how they ranked highest in terms of the happiness or positive emotion experience. And the countries color-coded in red are the ones who were the bottom 10 countries. So what was interesting, there were 2 very, very curious and interesting findings. One is that if you see the top 10 countries, very interestingly, there's like a cultural cluster happening here where majority of the top 10 countries were from Latin America. Now, when you see the bottom 10 countries color-coded in red and you take like a quick glance, they kind of make sense because they are either countries with low per GDP capita or they are from politically unstable countries. But what stood out was the country that ranked last. Steve, do you want to guess what the country was?
Well, I mean, there's so many countries in the world. I would just imagine that it is probably of the same profile of the other ones, like a country that is maybe an emerging market or has more political or socioeconomic instability, maybe.
Right. So that would be like a logical response or that's what you would guess. But very curiously, Singapore was ranked last, the bottommost country, which caught everyone's attention. There was a lot of PR done in the study. And it stuck out like a sore thumb because Singapore is one of the highest, richest countries in the world. And there was a lot of debate that ensued in the research world where researchers were like, okay, do these polls actually measure the intended subject matter, which is how happy are the countries? Or is there something happening, like an underlying reason that means maybe countries differ in the way they use scales or the way they respond to surveys? And that's exactly the crux of this discussion today. And so we want to tease apart, like, do these polls actually actually tap into behavior and usage and attitudes, or there's also some bias creeping in terms of the use of response scales? And there have been quite a few studies done in this area. So there are, here I just summarize a few. These studies basically took a look at a host of different inter-country surveys, and some themes emerge in this map that you see. One thing that stands out is if you look at the extreme response, the country that ranks highest in extreme response and is way high on the scale of acquiescence, you see Latin American countries. So
just to clarify for a second, the chart that we're looking at right now, this is a different study from the one you showed previously where Singapore is ranked last.
Yeah.
But this was also an experiment. This was less of a study, but more of an experiment about response scales, trying to explore the differences.
Yeah, so this study, basically what they did is they kind of looked at various different cross-country studies. And it's not an experiment that they ran, but they just looked at the literature and they kind of did an analysis of different cross-country studies and try to see if there's any clusters of countries that emerge in terms of their response patterns. And what they found is interesting.
If I could also just ask for a second, just maybe to clarify those scales, like on the X and Y axes, extreme response versus midpoint response, or high versus low acquiescence, what is that actually measuring?
Right. So if you look at the acquiescence level, that's typically related to agreement scales. So high acquiescence means you're more likely to agree with something, and low acquiescence means you're more likely to disagree with something. Mid-level would be your neutral. On the x-axis, you see it's not specific to agreement scales. It could be like satisfaction scales, or say if you're more likely to do something. So an extreme response means you are more likely to answer with the extreme ends of the scale.
Got it.
Even distribution means you're equally likely to select both ends of the scale. Midpoint is you're hovering in the middle.
Right.
So what they find here is that Latin American and South European markets are more likely to adopt high acquiescence and extreme response styles. So that's where they kind of hover around. And which means, what does that mean for market research? This means that when you do global satisfaction, loyalty, and branding studies, these countries are more likely to emerge to score the highest. On the other hand, when you look at Singapore tends to kind of stay somewhere in the middle. So they're less likely to agree with something or disagree with something. They're less likely to be extremely satisfied or extremely likely to recommend something. So they sit somewhere around in the middle in their response style. What that means is that typically when you do cross-country surveys, they have lower aggregate scores compared to other markets. So this is what existing literature says, but then of course the common question is why? Why do we see this differences in response pattern? And one of the most popular theories is the Hofstede's cultural dimension theory. So Gerd Hofstede is a very, very popular personality in social psychology, and a lot of inter-market culture studies kind of use this framework to try and understand why is it that certain countries respond in a distinct manner compared to others. And just to give you a very, very easy example, in our previous example, we saw that Latin American participants tend to be more extreme in their responses. They're more likely to agree with something. And what is used to explain that is something known as individualism versus collectivism. So Latin American countries typically are known to be very social, gregarious. They have like very high familial and social bonding, and hence they tend to be more likely to be agreeable with something, or they are more expressive. Hence, this is one of the kind of frameworks used to explain why is it that even on response scales, they tend to be more agreeable and more expressive. On the other hand, there's also something known as a power distance index. And Singapore has a high power index of 74. So higher the power index, which means that your country or society is very hierarchical. You are typically governed by more authoritative regime, or basically it's very hierarchical and structured, which means they are less likely to show and agree, like less likely to have an extreme opinion, and which is also used to explain why Singapore kind of hovers around in the middle. So this brings us to our own Milieu experiment. So we were very keen to carry forward existing literature and expand on it with a focus on Southeast Asia. So a lot of the existing literature consists mainly of like Western countries. You typically see North American, European, or Latin American markets as the focus. So we were keen on focusing on Southeast Asia, where Milieu is based. And Southeast Asia is often clubbed together, but it is a very heterogeneous region of its own, with every country having its own distinct culture. And beyond that, we also wanted to see how variances in methodology could also have an effect on how respondents respond to scale. I don't think you can just bucket responses, like you can't just have a blanket kind of statement saying, hey, Singaporeans are low on acquiescence bias. We also wanted to see if maybe varying the type of response scale used, if we vary the scale length, if we vary the scale design format, and even subject matter, do we see similar behavior across these different methodologies? So we want to kind of delve deeper and tease apart the methodology. So with that, I would like to maybe just kind of give a quick overview of how we thought about the questionnaire design. So the questionnaire, every participant or respondent did the same questionnaire, and the questionnaire consisted of 24 questions. Now, as I mentioned, we didn't want to we wanted to use a robust methodology. So we ensured that the questionnaire had different types of questions and did not limit itself to just say maybe survey satisfaction scores or brand dipstick score. We kind of wanted to play around with different subject matters. So we divided the questionnaire into 3 sections. The first section consisted of 10 questions, which had attitudinal questions. So these are basically general attitude questions around universal themes like, to what extent do you agree that exercising is good for health, or climate change is a real thing? So these were very like attitudinal questions, and we used a mix of agreement, likelihood scales, importance scales, satisfaction scale, etc. Now, the second section consisted of 8 questions, and these were questions centered around product test. So these were basically a design test where we showed them 2 different products, and they were asked to share their likability they were asked to rate the likability of the design, how likely are they to purchase it, and would they recommend this product to their friends and family. So we showed them 2 different kinds of products with very different aesthetics to see if maybe their responses differ. Third was a very popularly done customer satisfaction survey. So these are very common inter-market research questions, where here what we did is we asked them to rate their experience of their current smartphones. So they answered questions around ease of use, how likely are they to recommend their smartphone brand, their purchase intent when they buy their next phone, and questions centered around how satisfied they are with their current smartphone. So again, the underlying objective was to kind of have a robust questionnaire with different.
Got it. Yeah. And just to ask some questions about this design. So there were obviously different types and lengths of scales tested.
Yes.
But every respondent, you basically had different groups, and every respondent would have seen all of these sections and questions in the sections. Exactly. But only see one scale.
That's correct. So which brings me to the next slide. So to build on Steve's question, you're right. Every participant saw the exact same 24 questions. The only way they differed is the type of response scale they had to use. So this was a monadic design in the sense that each respondent only saw one type of rating scale. So the first group just saw the same questions, but they had to use a 5-point labeled ordinal scale. The second group saw a 6-point scale. So for these 2, every point of the scale was labeled. The other two groups had a longer rating scale, a 7-point scale, and a very commonly used 11-point scale, which is a typical NPS style scale. The difference for the 7-point and 11-point scale is that it's partially labeled. So you only have the extremes and the neutral option labeled. And these were run across 6 markets. As you mentioned, it was run across Southeast Asia. So we had 6 markets covered under it. And we ensured that every market we ran at least every survey was run at least between 300 to 500 respondents. So we have a decent margin of error, and we controlled it for age and gender. They were representative of the markets by age and gender.
Got it. So 4 surveys, each survey is a different type, length, and format of scale, times 6 countries, times 300 to 500 samples. So that's, I see there, it's N equals 15,000 responses across, what is it, 24 surveys?
Yeah.
Got it. And maybe just go back to the previous slide for 1 second, just to ask you, like, why, just for the audience, like, why have questions across these different modules, like attitudinal versus product versus customer satisfaction?
Yeah, so one thing I found in the existing literature is whenever these cross-country studies were carried out, they typically focused on one type of question survey. So it would either be like brand loyalty, or it would be NPS scores. And what I thought, like based on my experience as a researcher, I also found that the level of risk, the responses also differ depending on your subject matter. So for instance, a product test where you're asked to be critical about the design, you may be a bit more opinionated. You may be a little more varied in terms of your rating. Whereas when you look at attitudinal and attitudinal questions, because it's not anchored to actual behavior, your frame of mind may be very theoretical. It may not be grounded on actual usage. Whereas customer satisfaction questions are grounded on actual usage of a product. So you may be more opinionated on those kind of questions as well. So I thought it would be good to kind of mix up the type of questions and see whether the cultural differences are salient, even when you vary the different types of questions and different frame of mind that the respondents need to put themselves in.
Got it. So having these different kind of modules of questions or sections of questions is essentially a way to control for the subject matter of the question being essentially like an intervening variable in the study. And I think you gave an example of like attitudinal questions were kind of generic lifestyle questions, like on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever scale you're using, you know, how much do you agree with like exercise is important, et cetera. Could you give just maybe one brief example of a question that might have shown up in the product test and in the customer satisfaction?
Sure. Yeah. So in the product test, as you can see, these were the actual images shown. So we showed them 2 different products. So the first set of questions, we showed them this image here, and then we asked them, keeping in mind the design that you just saw, how do you like the design? And it was like, I love it, I like it, I hate it, or I dislike it. So it was something related to how they feel about the design. And then we asked them how likely are you to buy this next time you go out to look for a water bottle. How likely are you to buy this particular product, and how likely are you to recommend it to your friends and family? So that's an example of the product test. So we did this across 2 different designs, one a really mundane, if I may say, ugly design, and one an aesthetically pleasing, because we wanted to vary. We wanted to see if are there certain markets who say I like it to everything, irrespective of what design they are shown. So we wanted to throw in some kind of variability to actually see whether there are certain countries that go along with anything that's kind of thrown at them. Customer satisfaction, the reason why we had this section is that because this is very, very commonly done by brands, and this is anchored to actual behavior. I felt like attitudinal and product tests, they're still answering questions to something that's a little subjective. In customer satisfaction, we asked them, hey, what's the brand of smartphone that you currently use? And then we asked them a question of how satisfied are you with your current smartphone brand? And there was a satisfaction scale. Then we asked them how easy it is to use, and so on and so forth.
Great. Yeah. Thanks.
No problem. So now coming to the meat of the discussion, what did we observe? So first, I'd like to kind of show you the spread of responses across different countries. And this is a chart that I really, really like because what you see here is how the different countries responded on a 6-point scale. So what you're seeing here is their average responses across all 24 questions for a 6-point scale. And each curve belongs to a country, which is color-coded by a unique color. So blue would be Singapore, red would be Malaysia, and so on and so forth. On the x-axis, what you see is the response scale. So what I mean by response scale, yeah.
And the response scale, there were 4 different scales tested. This is one of the 4. And can you remind me, is the 6-point scale, was it an ordinal, like labeled scale, or was it an interval? Got it.
Yeah.
So it was a fully labeled scale from like strongly agree to strongly disagree. And what
That's
you've
correct.
done on that next slide is you've essentially averaged out the result of every single question, those 24 questions, for everyone. Okay. And
that's
so
exactly right.
So the 6, on the response scale on that axis, the 6 would always, the higher on the scale is generally more positive ends of the
Correct.
scale, right? And the 1s or lower is more negative ends of the scale. Okay, got
That's exactly right. Yeah. The highest, like 6, would always mean that they've either strongly agreed with something or they're extremely satisfied. And the lower the number, the less positive the response. So I know this is a lot happening here. So what I like about this is that the curves actually tell you how different the countries are from each other. And what typically you want to see here is some things that stand out is that some countries have a very prominent peak compared to others. Singapore, for example, is a little more spread out. And what it tells you is that different countries use this response scale very differently, like how they use different points of the scale depends on the country. Now, I know this is like a lot of curves happening in one, so maybe let's look at Singapore, for example. So what stands out immediately for Singapore is that it doesn't have as high a peak as other countries. What that tells you is that they don't have a very strong preference for one particular point of the scale, and they're more likely to use the scale a little more evenly compared to other markets. So they are equally likely to use a 4-point or a 5th point of the scale. And they are also, like compared to other countries, more likely to use the lower end of the scale as well. So you have a much more smoother curve. On the other hand, Indonesia is something that sticks out because it has the highest peak. Now, not highest peak at the 5th point of the scale. So what it tells you is that close to 47% of the respondents were likely to choose the second top choice of the 6-point scale. So they have a strong preference to use the second last. Vietnam, on the other hand, it's interesting. Vietnam, on the other hand, doesn't have as high as a peak as Indonesia, but they are more likely to use the top 2 ends of the scale, especially if you look at the top. Vietnam and Philippines are more likely to kind of gravitate towards the top end of the scale. So again, the point of this spread of responses is to show you that every country has a very distinct way of using the different points of a scale.
One thing that sticks out to me is that obviously the intensity of the curves varies by the country. The shape of the curve is identical for all of them. So they all it's not like you have kind of essentially an even scale. You have as many negatives, like 1, 2, 3, as positives, 4, 5, and 6. And it's not like it's like really distributed. Things definitely skew to the positive end of the scale, but there's always a peak and a dip that comes after the dip, which it's just interesting to me that every single country kind of has a different flow, but there's the same shape of that scale in every country.
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up, because that's exactly what you see in this graph. So in this graph, we see the polarity of the answers. So how are they in terms of net positive, net neutral, and net negative? So what I mean by this is that the green color shows their net positive response. So what I mean by net positive response is, see, on a 5-point scale, I would code strongly agree and agree as positive.
Got it.
disagree and strongly disagree as negative, and neutral speaks for itself, it's neutral. And for this particular analysis, I used only the odd scales. So I just used the 5, 7, and 11. So you have clear, positive, negative, and neutral. And
so we're ignoring
yeah,
the 6-point scale.
yeah, for this.
And everything else is obviously an odd ended scale. And is
Yeah.
this now what is going into this chart? Is it, since you have 3 different scales, is it every question from all
Every
3 of those
question.
scales? Okay,
Yes.
so there's a lot of data sitting underneath this.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
lot of
okay.
data that's gone into it. But the takeaway, like as you mentioned rightly, your observation regarding the curve is that Southeast Asia tends to be more, or indexes a little more on the positive end of the scale. And this is what you typically see, that they tend to kind of skew towards the positive end of the scale. But there are some interesting differences. Like, for example, Singapore is more slightly less likely to net out on positive, be net positive, and they're more likely to be neutral, which aligns with what we saw in the Gallup and the other past countries, that they tend to be slightly more likely to be neutral in their responses. And Malaysia and Singapore also slightly more likely to be more expressive in terms of the negative end of the scale.
Well, it is interesting because yes, the Singapore has the highest proportion of net negative, but also next to Malaysia, they're tied. But they're also they're not that much more extreme than the other countries like Thailand and Indonesia. What does have a much higher proportion is that group of people going into the neutral, which is interesting because, again, when you contrast it to the Gallup study that showed Singapore dead last as the unhappiest or least happy country, I think like that's not quite what this is showing. It does show that Singaporeans tend to move closer to neutral when responding to survey questions and stuff like that. But you don't see this explosive kind of set like proportion in the negatives.
Yeah, that's also because Gallup used a binary scale. This was a yes or no, which had no room for, again, important tip for like survey design. Binary scales are not great because you miss out on the nuances. In the next section, we will focus on the top choice selection. So we want to see how the countries differ in their choice of using the highest point of the scale. Now, before we dive into the discussion, I just wanted to orient everyone on what we are measuring here. So what I mean by the top choice selection means, say, for instance, it's a 5-point scale. What percentage of respondents chose the highest point in the scale? So here it would be strongly agree. And here you see the graphs here show you the top choice selection rate for different scale lengths. So you see that for a 5-point scale, 6-point scale, 7-point scale, and 11-point scale. And the colors denote the different countries. Now, what sticks out here is the extreme ends. So what you see consistently is that Singapore, across the different scale lengths, is the least likely to have a top choice bias, or like a high propensity to select the top point on the scale. On the other end, you have Vietnam and Philippines, who consistently net out to be more likely to be selecting the top choice no matter which scale. However, there's a bit of but in between, in the countries that fall in between, you see that as you move from a 5-point scale to, say, a 7 or 11-point scale, the between countries kind of, you see a little more nuance build up as you move higher, which makes sense because in the 5-point scale, you only have 5 options. So you see that all these 3 countries are kind of hovering in the same score, but as you give them more options, you bring about the different shades between the countries. So the longer the scale, the more variances you see between countries. But an interesting point, Steve, this is something we had also observed before, is that here what we're trying to see is the variance. By variance, what I mean is that how does each country vary from the mean score? So here, just for ease of discussion, I've just focused on Singapore and Vietnam. So what we're seeing here is that, say, in the 5-point scale, Vietnam is likely to be 11 points higher than the mean score. That means they are more likely to choose the highest point by 11 percentage points compared to like the average.
So you're not talking about a percentage uplift or percentage change. It's the
Yeah,
absolute percentage points. So
correct.
if it's plus 11 from 35, that basically means that it was 24 was your average for
Yes,
that
that's correct.
particular awesome. Okay, got
For
it.
that, yeah. So what we see here is that Singapore's variance is pretty stable from the mean, no matter what point of the scale. But you see that as you increase the scale length, Vietnam's variance from the mean reduces. So what one can take away from here is that the longer the scale length, like 11-point scale, can potentially reduce the top choice bias that a country like Vietnam may have.
Got it.
Uh,
So there's some very interesting things happening here because one, we do see Singapore, a country like Singapore, consistently lower on top choice selection. And again, remembering
yeah,
that top choice is generally positive ends of scales.
correct.
And what we're seeing here is that when you isolate markets, like in this case, is it Vietnam and the Philippines, that have a higher propensity towards top choice bias. So just people going right to the top of the scale, increasing the length of the scale will decrease that effect.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the takeaway from here is that, like, we are studying this for Southeast Asia, but if you are interested in a different set of markets, it is a good idea to get a sense, if you have the opportunity to, or if you have the resources to, get a sense of how your markets net out in terms of their top choice selection. And if you see that certain countries have a very, very clear bias in terms of a top choice bias, it may serve you well to kind of use a longer scale length if you want to reduce the variance in terms of their top choice bias and, yeah, have a
Got it.
cleaner set of data to work with.
It's probably worth just mentioning now because I know that some viewers might already be thinking about this, like, oh, well, how is the scale designed? And I think you might show this later on, but just worth mentioning at this point that the way that this was implemented was that they would have to interact with the scale in order to, on those 11 points, to be able to move forward. So it's not like it was designed so that the top of the scale was just the first thing they saw and they pressed it
Yes,
and moved on. We've already cleaned the data to get rid of straight liners, and also the
yes.
mechanics of the scale require them to engage with it in some way before they proceeded. So just in
Yeah,
case anyone's thinking about that.
yeah, that's a great point and actually a good segue to our next point. But before that, I'd also want to quickly show you that I also analyze the data in terms of the subject matter. So what you're seeing here is their aggregated scores across all scales, but here you're just seeing how they vary depending on the subject matter. And what we see is that Philippines and Vietnam's preference for the top choice is consistent across different survey types, and Singapore being lower in terms of their propensity to choose the top choice is also consistent across subject matter, but the extent to which you see this greatly depends on the subject matter. So something to take note of.
This is also interesting because each of these clusters, the brand usage versus product test versus general attitudes, are all different heights. If you average out the height of all of them, they're all at a different level. Brand and
Yeah,
usage, customer satisfaction is the highest, product
yeah,
testing is the lowest. So, what
yeah,
I can take away from this is that people are much more likely to have strong opinions when it comes to brand ratings.
yes.
I assume brands that they like or maybe dislike. But then when it comes to product feedback, this is where there's probably a less likelihood for people to be in the strong opinion camp. And then general attitudes are kind of generic questions where you probably see a lot more neutrals and stuff like that. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
right.
It
That's
kind
super
of
interesting.
gels. Yeah, it kind of gels with our hypothesis that the reason why we use these different survey topics is brand usage and customer satisfaction is anchored to actual behavior, actual usage of a product. So if you're asking them questions which ground on usage, where they can relate to, you're more likely to get extreme responses. So yeah, just to take away that the subject matter matters. Yeah.
Got it.
Now, the second thing that we wanted to kind of focus on is that the rating scale format. Now, we've been discussing the results, and all the questions typically use a rating scale, but rating scales too can come in very different visual formats, right? And we wanted to see if what type of format you use can also have some bearing in the results and in terms of the top choice bias. So just to give you an example, here we test two different rating scale formats. So on the left, you see, so for both these questions, we show you an example of 11-point typical NPS rating scale. On the left-hand side, it's essentially a single select question with radio buttons. So here, what the participant would typically do is they would see this, and what jumps out is that they are not seeing all the response options at one go, which is something, if your research is carried out on a smartphone, there's limited real estate space. So here you are forcing the respondents to select an option which starts from the highest, which is 10, very likely 9, 8, 7, 6. And if they have an opinion or in the lower end of the scale, they'll have to scroll further down. On the right-hand side, we also tested a spinner scale format. So this is essentially, as Steve mentioned earlier, this requires respondents to engage with this rating scale. You would have to, it's kind of like a ticker. And an important differentiating factor is that here you start from the neutral rather than orient the scale from the top choice. So we test out these two formats to see if they have any bearing on the top choice bias.
So just to clarify, and this is the Milieu surveys interface. This is all of the surveys that we do are inside of a proprietary app. But basically on the left side, you've got the standard format for a single select or rating scale as radio buttons, and they would have to see the proceed button, they first have to choose an option, and then they scroll to the bottom, and the continue button is hooked to the bottom. But again, it'll be ghosted out if they just scroll to the bottom. They have to interact with it. And then on the right side, the spinner is actually a natively supported UI of both Apple and Android. And it's a very good format, especially when it comes to rating scales. But in our particular case, like you mentioned, Ant, it will default to the middle of the scale. And you see that little button is ghosted out. So for the viewers, what ends up happening is they have to tap and drag the scale up or down before the continue button is made available. So again, there needs to be some tactile input for the respondent to be able to go forward. Otherwise, you might see lots of straight liners or more people just kind of powering through the survey.
Yep, that's exactly right. So now, as I mentioned, we were curious to see how the top choice selection rate differs between these two formats. And for this discussion, we've zeroed in on Philippines and Vietnam because these were the two countries that had a higher top choice selection rate. And what you see on each of these graphs is the blue line indicates their response on an 11-point scale using the spinner format. The gray dotted line refers to the standard single select response format. Now, what we see is very, very interesting because on a standard scale, you see that 36% of the respondents chose the highest rating, which is the 10-point on 11-point scale. This drops down by 11 points, which is like highly significant, to 25% when they use a spinner scale. Again, this was very, very interesting because it has implications on what conclusions you draw. Similar behavior with Vietnam. When you use a standard scale, 40%, close to half, rate the highest point in a 11-point scale. This drops by 17% to 23% using a spinner scale.
The effect size is enormous, both especially for Vietnam, but both of them. Like
exactly.
It has such, as both of us being researchers and people who also like analyze the data, that completely changes like how you would convey or like interpret the data.
Exactly.
So some really massive findings.
Yep. And if you were to hypothesize why this is happening, again, I think the response scale in a way speaks for itself. In a standard response length, you kind of start from the highest point. And if a country already has a bias towards a top choice, this kind of reinforces it. But having a spinner scale where you start from a neutral standpoint rather than from the highest rating, you're kind of forcing the respondent to engage with the scale and put in a little more thought into their answers rather than go for the highest response.
And the charts on the next screen, this is already post data cleaning. So you've already cleaned out like people who failed QC and straight liners and all that. Yes. So this is a really clear takeaway, I think, for researchers, is that if you're doing particularly a long scale, never use just a standard radio button format on a log scale. But the other challenge for some researchers is that they may not be using scripting software that actually supports a spinner or a slider. Now, the thing is, a lot of survey tools I notice have sliders, but the sliders go left to right. We didn't get a chance to test that, but I think that, if you have the spinner functionality, fabulous. If not, just be wary of running a long response scale in the radio button format, because this slide in particular is shocking. And again, we're talking about specific countries, I guess, too. This is Philippines and Vietnam that are clearly indexed quite high for over selection or being high acquiescence, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have the chart here, but like Thailand, for example, both the lines were pretty similar, which shows that much higher diligence in terms of their respondents. Like no matter which scale format, the two response styles are very similar. So yeah, it's very country specific. And we also tested the rate of straightlining. By straightlining, we mean the likelihood of selecting the same response across all questions. Now, blue refers to the standard scale, 11-point refers to the spinner scale. So using a standard response scale, especially for Vietnam, they were more likely to select the same response option across all questions. This dropped to 3% when they were engaging with a spinner scale. So again,
since the straightliners are a group of respondents you would have cleaned out for the other charts, this is essentially the percentage of respondents that you essentially would clean out from a standard survey.
That's right.
But what's fascinating here is there's this assumption that people who fail QC are all bad apples. But what you're actually seeing here is that the design of the survey can actually push people into being a bad respondent in some way, because in particular, again, depending on the country, but the difference in it's almost double for Vietnam in terms of the straight lining between 11-point spinners and the standard scale. Which means that the design of the survey allowed or enabled people to be, have bad behavior in a survey, which is interesting.
Yeah, I guess user experience matters a lot in terms of your respondents' attention levels and their fatigue levels. So yeah, just goes on to show user experience can make a lot of difference.
Right. And just to belabor the point that not all QC respondents go into a survey with bad intentions. Sometimes the people that you might QC out or clean out become bad apples because of your survey design. So another, I think, a great takeaway. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. And as Steve was mentioning, we just tested two kinds of formats, but other platforms, you may find different types of rating scales. For instance, there's this slider rating scale where you slide across different options, which is different from the radio button selection. Again, this may be something you may want to use, but at the end of the day, you would need to keep in mind that user experience is everything. Like, well, this may look great on a desktop screen. It may not translate well on a very small smartphone screen. Some platforms also advocate the usage of visual rating scales when it comes to cross-country research. Theory being is that language sometimes doesn't translate very well across countries, but having like visual emoticons may be more language agnostic. Again, there were some studies which showed that it reduced variance by a third. But then again, we haven't tested this, but these are some other options of how you may want to think about cross-country research.
So there's some great findings here, but I think we know that the starting point here is that a standard radio button format for a scale is a bad idea. And spinners, if it's available to you, is a good solution. If it's not, there's probably opportunities for us or even other research companies to invest in this kind of research and find out if visual scales like this actually can overcome those issues. Because the thing that I've seen from this data too is that it can have such a massive impact on the results and your takeaways from them. And people will you talk about product tests, people will say, great, 40% of people loved our product. Let's fund it and get it going. Whereas if you just ask the question in a different way, you actually get different results. So
it has real life implications and business implications. So you might want to take this very seriously. Nice. All right. So that's the end of the discussion in terms of results from our experimental studies, but we just wanted to wrap it up by some key takeaways. Like if you're someone who is going to carry out cross-cultural, cross-country research, what are some key points that you can take into consideration before diving in so that you can reduce the bias that creeps in due to just differences in survey taking behavior? So first few steps are some basic hygiene steps, which I think seems very logical and intuitive, but it's good to kind of reiterate it. One, ensure consistent survey instruments. If you're like in our studies, we carried out the same 24 questions across all markets. So ensure that you have the same set of questions, same questionnaire across all markets, because even slight changes in the order of the questions asked or your the way your question is framed may introduce bias. So you want to reduce as much variability as possible. So keep your questionnaires consistent, ensure consistent survey modes. So if you're carrying out desktop research for one country, ensure the remaining markets is also desktop research. So don't do smartphone surveys in one and other modes in the other. So you want to reduce that.
That's a tricky one because in some markets too, big companies will often work with panel providers, and sometimes those panel providers will top up from other providers, and sometimes those surveys can be taken on either a desktop or a mobile.
That's interesting.
And I think a lot of survey platforms now are responsive, but the response interface changes completely when it goes it's common to see like grid questions on a desktop are shown as a grid, and then they get condensed down to an accordion menu on a mobile device, and like it just changes the way the question is shown. So absolutely. I think for researchers, if you're working with a vendor, if the panel provider is sourcing from different panels, you might want to find out, hey, is this desktop only or mobile only, or do they allow hybrid experiences? And if so, you might want to see some of them have the ability to prevent surveys from being taken on a desktop or things like that.
Yep, that's a great point. And in case you have to introduce a hybrid mode of survey taking, you might maybe want to control, like have a similar proportion of desktop respondents, smartphones, like at least control for the percentage of respondents based on survey mode. So yeah, great point there. Then the third point is use the same response scale lengths. Keep that consistent, because the one takeaway we've seen in our results is that depending on the response scale length, you may have very different top choice bias, or you may have very different scores. So you may want to keep that consistent. Ensure translations are done well. Again, this can't be taken for granted, because the quality of your responses are only as good as the way your questions are kind of worded. And you may want to keep language nuance, like maintain nuances in languages. So we do quite a bit of cross-cultural research. And for some of them, we do outsource it to third-party translation services, but we always do one round of vetting just to ensure that the context of the surveys or the essence of the questions are, maintained even after translating. So it's worth kind of putting an extra pair of eyes after you've got your translations from a third-party service, just to ensure that your questions translate. Another quick point is also that just because you're doing a survey in a different market doesn't mean you only have the translated versions. So for instance, if you do a survey in Malaysia, it doesn't mean that all our surveys are in Bahasa Malay. You need to take into account what language the respondent is most comfortable in. So if English is their main mode of communication, let them do it in English. But if Bahasa Malay is their first language of choice, and let them do the survey in what language they're most comfortable in, rather than assuming a local market is going to be comfortable doing it only in the main local language. So design format of the response scale also matters, as we have discussed in length. The type of rating scale that you use can also potentially introduce bias and worsen certain biases, like top choice bias. So ensure that you have a scale that is conducive, so that you kind of remove any type of biases that makes your data not very reliable. The next thing you want to keep in mind is also to clean out potentially inattentive respondents. So this is a QC or quality control mechanism you must have in place. So for instance, here we weeded out those who had a tendency of straightlining. That means they select the same response option across all questions. So cleaning out these inattentive respondents may also reduce any biases and help you arrive at a data set that's cleaner, and you may be more confident in terms of like comparing your data across markets. So yeah, clean out bad respondents to reduce further bias. And last, just a quick point, like some survey companies or some researchers also are aware of inter-country biases in the way they respond to scale. So one of the ways to counteract is some of them kind of come up with an index or some kind of weighted scale or a weighted factor by which they standardize the responses across all questions. So they see how much of a variance, intermarket variance there is. They come up with like a weight factor, and then they standardize their responses to remove biases. Now, that again is not really a great method because as we've seen from the results here, the way biases are seen depends on the subject matter. It depends on the type of scale used. So to come up with like one weight factor that standardizes the responses, you may be eliminating actual differences that are there. So again, instead of using like a standardization method, one thing you can consider doing is using intra-country benchmarking data rather than inter-country comparison. So just to give you an example, if you're a brand and you're measuring NPS scores for a product across countries, rather than comparing NPS score of Vietnam for an automobile company to Singapore, you may want to actually compare your brand's performance to a benchmark for the automobile industry. So have if benchmark scores are accessible to you, and if that's something you can kind of lean on, you'd rather have an intra-country comparison rather than just do a inter-country comparison. Yeah, with that, we wrap up with our takeaways, and that's the end of this discussion. Yep, I hope these tips and considerations can improve your research experience when you carry out any cross-country market surveys. And yeah, I hope you find this useful.
Okay, Antarika, this was incredibly insightful. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing the results of your study. There's going to be an article posted online that you've written, which also kind of details the experiment and the results. And I'm not sure, we might be sharing more of this data, but to any of the viewers, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can get in touch with us. We're also happy to share some of this data. Again, this is Antarika. How long did this take you to pull together the experiment?
A few months, yeah.
Yeah, and it was done over a couple of iterations. So I don't know for sure, but I think this might be one of the biggest studies on this kind of particular topic, with 15,000 samples and multiple iterations, 6 countries. So an immense amount of work that went into this. So again, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing today. And yeah, it was
thanks, Steve.
very fruitful
My
discussion.
pleasure.